In Chumash Bereshis, there are 3 mitzvahs, as opposed to the other Chumashim have many more. The 3 mitzvahs in the Torah, the mitzvahs Milah and Parshas, in mitzvahs Perivirivi and Parshas Bereshis, the mitzvahs Milah and Gid Anosha. However, besides the 3 mitzvahs, many other places throughout Chumash Bereshis, Chazal learn dinim from the Psukim. For an example, in this week's parsha, Vashbiacha, Avram Avinu was Mashbia Eliezer. The Gemara in Shavuos makes a drasha to learn that when you make a shvu, you need an akitas chayfetz. You have to hold something, an item of a mitzvah. In today's shiur, we're going to discuss what the poskim speak about from this week's parsha, which is actually to elaborate a din in the Gemara in Brachas. The Gemara in Brachas, it's a Gemara daf lamed daled amud beis. The Gemara says, Amar of Kahana, Chatzef alai man de matzli bebiksa. It's a chutzpah, one who davens in a valley. Chatzef alai, it's a chutzpah, man de matzli, the one who davens bebiksa in a valley. What's the problem to daven in a valley? So Rashi explains, I'll read you the Lashon Rashi, Kishehu b'makom tznius, when a person's in a secluded area, a place that's closed, b'makom tznius, chala olav emes melech, he has the fear of the king. V'li by nishbar, he has a broken heart. In other words, a person can daven more b'kavana when he's in an enclosed area, as opposed to if a person davens bebiksa in the valley, which means in an open area. So the Gemara says a halacha, which is actually brought on Shulchan Aruch, Simin Tzadik, Sif Hey, that a person is not supposed to daven out in the open. Obviously, we're going to explain what, where, when, but a person should not daven in the open, and the reason is because a person can't be mechaven properly. Inside, you can be mechaven, you have emes melech, and you fear from the melech, as well as also libay nishbar, you more have a broken heart to be mechaven better properly by davening. Tosfos asks right there on that Gemara, Tosfos asks from this week's parsha. This week's parsha, it says, Vayetze Yitzchak lasuach basada. Yitzchak went outside, he went lasuach to daven, Rashi explains lasuach to daven basada in the field. So Tosfos asks, the pasuk says clearly that you could daven outside. Yitzchak went, that's when he was besak in mincha. Yitzchak went and davened outside. So how could the Gemara say that if you daven outside, it's a chutzpah? Yitzchak davened outside. Tosfos says 2 terutzim. The first teretz, Tosfos says, you want to know where Yitzchak went outside? Yitzchak went outside. The place where he went to daven was, what did you say? It says basada. I mean, there was a shul. Basada technically means outside. Tosfos says basada means Har Maria. He went to daven on Har Maria. That's the first teretz. What's the maila that he went to Har Maria? If Har Maria is outside, so it's still a problem. What's the maila? What's the adifus that it was Har Maria? There are 3 explanations. And the 3 explanations make an afkamina ladina. The first explanation, the Bach understands in Tosfos, that the mile of Har Maria was that there were walls around it. I don't know who put the walls up at that point, but the mile was there were walls. And this that the Gemara says it's a chutzpah to daven outdoor, since the Har Maria had walls around it, so it was no longer outdoors. So far we have that you're not allowed to daven outdoors ever, anywhere. Yitzchak went and davened outside. Yitzchak davened outside was talking about Har Maria, which Har Maria was technically indoors. There were walls. That's the first explanation in the first teretz of Tosfos, what Yitzchak did when he went basada, to daven in the field. The second pshat is the levush. The levush right here in Hilchas Tefillah on this siman in Shulchan Aruch, siman Tzadik, the levush says that since, let me just say the levush, and Yitziel, please take your question. The levush says that Har Maria was different for Yitzchak because Yitzchak was nekad ala akeda on Har Maria. He was nearly nifter over there. He was nearly nishchat on the Akedah. So for Yitzchak, even though it was out in the open, when he went up on Har Maria, it brought back that Ema of the Akedah. And therefore, even though you're not supposed to daven outside, but for Yitzchak it's different. In other words, it's not anybody that davens on the Har Maria could daven in the open. Yitzchak had exclusive on davening outside of the Har Maria because Yitzchak had Amos Melech on the Har Maria. Just to bring out, to illustrate this idea, the Kaf HaChaim says that if somebody has a place, Shenasa Nes, somebody was, let's say, in a car accident, he was almost nifter, and when he passes it, he's Nes'oyer over there, he was saved, his life was saved, but Chayei Gavana, he could also daven outside. It's the same idea of what Yitzchak was able to daven in the Har Maria, even though it was out in the open. It's a chutzpah because not to daven in the open, it's a problem because you can't be machaven, but over here you can be machaven. We'll get to the kaisel in a minute, but lefizeh, if the kaisel, Reb Shia is bringing out what's about the kaisel, if the kaisel will be considered open, so far you shouldn't be able to daven, it's considered you davening in the open. Why? The first teretz is that these walls around. If the kaisel doesn't have walls, it happens to be it has walls, even the outdoor one has walls. But even if it does not have walls, the first teretz Har Maria was because these walls, and the second teretz is because Yitzchak the Akedah. So if the kaisel would not have walls, you wouldn't be able to. You should not be able to daven outside the outside part. So this is the third pshat in Har Maria. But before the third pshat, I just want Yitzi. What was your question?
Going back to the point of the walls, you could have a property with a closed up fence around the property. There's no roof. You're still outside. So what's the difference? The walls are not. There's no roof over there.
So the point that you're saying about the no roof, we'll get to it soon.
Har Maria is a big har. So if you bring the fence all around the har.
If Trump builds a wall, is that going to make me get down anywhere now?
No, I'm serious. I'm being serious. You can have
So these 2 points, Yitzi, I understand what you're saying. Yitzi is saying that this idea that if you have walls around, what's if it's a huge property? Could you also, the point about no roof, that we'll get to soon. Let's get to that soon. But about the very big property, you're saying that it's like you're davening in the open. You're saying if there's going to be a wall around America, could you daven now anywhere outside? I hear. That's a ara, because Lamaisa Allah is if these walls, you could daven. You're saying you don't have the idea of being able to be li by dishbar.
It could be both answers. It could be that there was a wall around where the Akedah was, or something that was a historical thing. So you put a thing around it, he went and down. Who says it means around the whole mountain? Yeah, but you said when on Maria davened and there was a wall around. Doesn't mean there's a wall around the whole mountain. Maybe there was an enclosed area that he davened.
I don't know. This point, the point without the roof, we'll get to soon. But the point, how big the walls could be, I don't know. I didn't see anyone giving a shiur. And you have a point. If it's a wall about a huge property, how much liba nishbar could you have? It's almost like there's no wall. It's a good point. The third pshat in Tosfos' first teretz is that what's the mile of Har Maria? Not particularly for Yitzchak because he had the Akedah, but rather, like you mentioned, that's the place where Adam Harishon was born. That's the place where Noach brought Karbonis. That's the place where Avram made a Mizbeach. That's where Yitzchak was neked al gabi a Mizbeach. And the Lashon, the Mata Yehuda, Svardische Kadmon, the Mata Yehuda, he's the one who says this teretz, and he says that the Har Maria is a Mokim HaMigdash, Mokim Kapora, and therefore Ein Zakim Beis Elokim. So a person has the Imas HaShchina, V'li Nishbar. So even though the Har Maria is open, still a person could daven over there on the Har Maria, even though it's open, because you don't have the problem of davening in an open area. Because you have this Emes Melech. Lefi this, that the reason why Yitzchak was able to Yitzchak L'suach Basad to daven, even though it was outdoors, is because these are general Emes Melech and Har Maria. l'cha'ira should come out, even the kaisel. I don't know if you have exactly umakam kapara, but also the kaisel loizaza shchina makaisel ma'aravi. So even if it would be an open area without walls, you would still be able to daven there. And the truth is, the Shulchan Hatar and Zer Zav, he brings this this teretz that the Har Maria, the Maila is because it's a makam shchina, it's a makam where Adam Arisha Noach brought karbanos. He says the same idea should be by the kaisel as well. I would think, it's a good shaila, I didn't see anyone speaking in this case, but I would think based on the other teretz that we saw, like the Kaf HaChaim says, that Yitzchak was able to daven on the open on Har Maria because it was a place that was neked al gabi HaMizbeach, and therefore he says, Mokum Shenasa by Nes. So the Kaf HaChaim, it doesn't have to be Dafka Shenasa by Nes. Any place that could be Nesoyer of Yerushalayim, L'chayra should come out that din. Good point. Like Auschwitz, if a person goes there, L'chayra should be even in the open also, based on the same teretz of Har Maria, they should be able to daven there. These are yes,
so
Asher.
How do you reconcile this with the concept of going out and being in nature, meaning in the presence of Hashem, and experiencing the greatness?
Asher's asking very well. These for sure an Indian of going out into the Yisina Floyes Aboire, and a person can be mispoinen. There are those that go for Hisboididis. The Arizal went Erev Shabbos in Tzvas to Kabbalah Shabbos. He went in the outside. Boyichal, he went outside. I think this is all along the lines of what you're asking. So it's Mavur, the Pais can bring the Eishel Avram. The Bechucha says that this of davening outside, that you're not allowed to daven outside, that's only Shmoneh Esrei. Shmoneh Esrei, there's a certain din that when you daven Shmoneh Esrei, you're supposed to have Moire Melech, Emes HaMelech, you're davening a Flei HaMelech. But when you go out and you look in a Floyes HaBoirei, it's a different type of, call it avoida. When you go in and you see in the Floyes HaBoirei, you see an amazing bria, it's different than being oimid for Shmoneh Esrei. So this din that we're discussing now today is particularly for Shmoneh Esrei. Shmoneh Esrei is where you're supposed to daven dafka inside, which means even shachris. If you, let's say you want to daven, I'm not saying halachu lamaisa, but I'm saying an idea. If you want to daven psukah de zimra here in 18 on the bench by the trees, you could think you could be machaven. So that's not what the halacha is said. When it comes to Shmoneh Esrei, that's what the halacha is to daven indoors.
Do you think the guys, like all these people, like the Grand Canyon, they go back inside for Shmoneh Esrei? I don't know.
We can get to the end here.
Let's see. There's a few dinim that we have to get to, and even Tosfos has another teretz. So let's see over here. We saw three pshatim in Tosfos' first teretz. Tosfos says Har Maria. Either Har Maria had walls. Maybe the Grand Canyon also is considered has walls. Like we spoke before, how big are the walls? We'll see after everything if it covers that. One is that Har Maria has walls. The second teretz is, second explanation on Har Maria is that Yitzchak in particular had a Maila because he had the aim over there of the Arcada. The Kaf HaChaim says Nasa by Nes. And who mentioned? Asher mentioned, you mentioned about if a person goes to the place, let's say Auschwitz, a person's in this area over there, that's the second teretz. And the third teretz is for anybody that the Har Maria in particular is a place where there's Amos Melech and L'cheruad in the Kaisel, even if it would be open. There's another teretz on the Kasha of Yitzchak, which is really a new teretz, but I'm just bringing it over here in between the first and second teretz of Tosfos because it's like the first teretz. When it says that Yitzchak went to daven Basada, it's talking about, the Zohar says this, it's Basada Asher Kona Avraham, which means in the beginning of the parsha, he went to daven by the Maras HaMachpelah. That's where he went to daven. I don't know if he went inside the Ma'ara and therefore it's inside, but he went, that's the Sada that he davened. would be maybe along the lines of it's a mokum where these persons desire, but that's the Zoyer's teretz that he went to daven in the Marsa Machpelah.
Last thing is people thought probably didn't daven Shemon Esrei, it wasn't set so much later. It may fall under the...
Right, I hear. You're saying if it wasn't Shemon Esrei, it was Masakin. Mincha, that's a shmuz for itself when Tefillah was Nasakin. Yitzchak was Masakin Mincha, but it's a mokum Karbonis. That's the first teretz in Taisvis. The second teretz in Taisvis says, what's the problem of Biksa, of a valley? The problem is not davening outdoor. The problem is davening outdoor in a busy place. If you daven in the market or somewhere where people, Oivrim Veshavim, people are passing by, so you can't concentrate by Shemay Nesrei, you can't focus on davening. But Chayei Gavna, that's where the Gemara says one should not daven outdoors. One could daven outdoors, but not outdoors in a place where people are passing by and it disturbs davening. So what happened with Yitzchak? Where did Yitzchak daven? Yitzchak davened in a place like the Lashon HaBachas even, Shaloi Almat Sham Adam Olam. No one ever stepped there. But the idea was that Yitzchak davened in a place that there was no one there, or at least there wasn't a busy place of people passing by. So maybe Yitzchak was able to daven even though it was outside. That's Tosfos' second teretz. That's a good ara if you're right. Rabbi Shiur is pointing out, what's if it's inside and it's busy? I wanted to bring it up soon, but I'll bring it up already right now. Let's say over here, we have minyanim between 18 and the 18th tent, which is outside. It's outside, maybe outside. We're going to see soon, we'll get, there's a few more halachas that might make it much simpler to daven there. We're going to see it could be, it's not considered outside if you don't need 4 walls. Some say 1 wall is enough, so you have a wall. So I had the same question. Once it's considered with 1 wall inside, but there's still a problem, it's over in Rishav and people pass through. And Rabbi Shiur is pointing out a good point also by a wedding, a chasana, if you daven and it's busy. Person wants to daven on an airplane, it's indoors. But in most cases, it's the biggest over in Rishavim. For some reason, wherever you make that minyan, people have to pass through to get to the kitchen, to go to the bathroom. It's over in Rishavim. I'm not saying if you should or you shouldn't daven. I'm just bringing up Lafi what we're saying, over Veshavim that disturbs, L'chayru would be, comes out of here as a problem, but at least outdoor. Indoors, it's a good ara, because the Maisa, the Gemara says, Biksa, a valley. Maybe the Gemara just said a valley because that's a place where people pass by, but even indoors also, anywhere to make a minyan in the hallway. You have a meeting inside, you want to make a minyan, you step out, you make a minyan in the hallway. People pass by over there, it's even Veshavim. It's a good shiloh.
My father told me the Chatzkel Levenstein Mishkiach didn't daven at the Chatzkel with that.
Based off this, then you said Chatzkel Levenstein didn't daven by a chasana because.
The whole thing though is very subjective when it comes to like having kavana. So one guy has zero kavana when he gets focused in there. One person could be, at a baseball game and diving inside, but he couldn't care less about the game. He only wanted to play with his friends. For him, I could hear why he could dive inside. The other guy's gonna keep up, feel like he wants to look at the TV to check the sport. So he shouldn't. So I don't think. I don't know if it's something you can just kind of set in stone, black and white.
Yehuda, you're asking that sometimes a person could be machavan even outdoors. That's the bottom line you're asking.
Indoors, outdoors, you're asking what you do not kavana. You know yourself. You don't have kavana. You know this and this shoe you don't have kavana because that guy talks. One guy talks, gets anyway. They're doing davening. This guy doesn't bother them.
You're asking like this. You're asking that I'll show you that there are times that somebody can be outdoor and it can be unbelievable machavan, whether if it's the first teretz and Tosfos that even open is a problem or even for shavim. Person sometimes could daven. When he's davening, it doesn't make a difference. People could walk by. It's a good shaila. And for that, it's a good shaila, Yehuda. For that, I want to share with you the Beis Yosef asks, on the second teretz of Tosfos, the Beis Yosef asks, why is it a chutzpah for somebody to daven? It's a chutzpah for somebody to daven by even for shavim? Beis Yosef doesn't understand Tosfos' second teretz. Maybe you shouldn't do it because you're not going to be able to have proper kavanah. What's the chutzpah? So the Magen Avram answers this question, and the Magen Avram says, you know why it's a chutzpah? It's more like a gaiva. You show that you could be machaven even though people are passing by. So I think that's the answer to your question. You're asking, sometimes you'll have a person, you said he's by a game, or he's somewhere, and he could be machaven. The chutzpah is that he's not, what's the chutzpah? The chutzpah is, I could handle it. I could daven even though there's a lot going on. That's what the Magen Avram says. That's the second teretz of Tosfos.
No, but maybe the clip is also he's asking 9 other people to daven with him, even though he can concentrate, and they probably can't.
If what'd say?
9 other people to daven with him, and they can't concentrate.
Morty's bringing up of 9 other people. We'll get to that in a minute. I want to first say the Terutzim. We'll speak about a minyan also. Let's one thing at a time, and we'll get back to it.
I think your point goes more stark than what you just said. Is that I'm so bothered that I can't daven in shul with the guy talking, and the noise is bothering me, but I'm gonna be able to daven by the stadium or by some other where there's more noise going on. Like, what does that mean? So that's a more starker point. And you gotta focus on davening here versus there.
I hear what you're saying. The third teretz, we saw 2 terutzim and Tosfos. The third teretz, the Bach says, Vayetze Yitzchak lasuach basada. Rashi says, what's lasuach? Lasuach means to daven. Why doesn't it say Vayetze Yitzchak lehispalo? He went out to daven. Why does it say lasuach? So the Bach says lasuach is maloshan sichem, branches. When Yitzchak went out to daven, he went out, doesn't say in the woods, but he went out, he was surrounded by trees, and therefore, the whole problem, what the Gemara says, not to daven in the outside, is the outside. But if you're surrounded by trees, that's as if davening inside. That's the third teretz. So now we're going to go through a few dinim that come out in this din of not davening outside. First of all, we mentioned already before that this halacha of not davening outside is only for Shemoneh Esrei. As we mentioned before, people go out into the woods. His boy did this, Arizal went out Kabbalah Shabbos. These different, you can find other cases where you daven outside. Kiddush Levana, that's not such a good example, because you have to be outside. But many different times where you daven outside, but as long Shemoneh Esrei, the din not to daven outside is particularly Shemoneh Esrei. Another din, the Eishel Avram says, the Eishel Avram, the Bechucha says, that davening outside is only if there's no walls. If you have one wall, it's enough. You don't have to have 4 walls. One wall's enough, which therefore I would think davening over here between 18 house and the tent, in the summer when there's an overflow of minyan and people daven outside, if you're davening on the side, technically these gates and these walls also, but here should be better in a way because there's a wall. Even one wall's enough. We mentioned before, could be there's a different problem, Oivrim V'Shavim. These are different halacha completely, that you're not allowed to pass somebody that's davening Shemoneh Esrei, but in that din of not davening in the outside, you would have this mile of one wall. It doesn't say, I'm almost sure it doesn't say that you have to daven towards the wall. As long as there's one wall, it already makes it a little bit closed in. You're saying, what's if it's the back wall, you don't even feel it. See if I have it. I'm looking it up actually, you're right, Morty. He says if you have a wall in front of you. If there's no 3 walls around you, it's enough. So it has to particularly be the front wall. So you're right. What happens if you're not mamish by the wall and somebody passes by? That's the shaila. Oivrim v'shavim disturbing. Does that take away the mile of this one wall? But you're right. It has to be the wall, dafka the front wall. So you have to daven indoors. The Mishnah Berurah brings the Shari Tshuva that even though you have to be indoors, as long as these machitzas, it's enough even without a roof. And it brings a raya in Yerushalayim, the minyanim, the factories, the minyanim factories, the shtiblach, they used to daven in the chotzer, outdoors. Let's say in the summer for 6 months it almost doesn't rain. They used to daven outdoors. How did they daven outdoors? He says since it was mukav machitzas, even though there was no roof, it's enough. And therefore, lefiza, by the koisel, even to daven, there is no maila of davening inside the koisel, the inside part that has a roof, because the outside part also has 4 walls. has 4 walls. The front is the kaisel, the side is the ezes nashim, the other side is where you go inside, and the back. There's a proper wall. The whole chutzner of the kaisel, so it's so far back. I mean, it's a big room. So Ovrim v'Shavim, that's a good thing. There's definitely somewhat of Ovrim v'Shavim. So that's, as we spoke, I guess it depends where you stand and what time you're there, but it's these Ovrim v'Shavim, so that's something that, if anybody even has a maramokim on that, if these Ovrim v'Shavim indoors, which you pointed out by a chasana, l'chayra would come out, you have the Ovrim v'Shavim problem. However, even though we see that open ceiling is still considered indoors, the Mishnah Berurah brings the Zohar. The Zohar says that you should daven in a bias in a house dafka. This is the Mishnah Berurah in Sif Katan Yud Aleph. And Yud Beis he brings about without a roof. I'm not sure if Lefi the Zohar you should daven dafka with a roof, or he means bias as opposed to outside. The Zohar says you should daven in a house. What's if you're in a house without a roof? Is that you makayim the Zohar also? But that's what we have so far. The halach is dafka shmay nesrei. 1 wall is enough, and even if there's no roofs, it's still considered indoor. The Kaf HaChaim brings from the Rishonim, from the Tosfos Varid, that this whole din is only if you're davening b'yechidus. If you daven b'minyan, you can daven outside. This is very important. Sometimes you make a minyan, you're on a road trip or something, you make a minyan. If you make a minyan, you can daven outside. Ovrim v'Shavim, again, we're not clear what Ovrim v'Shavim, but when there's a minyan, you can daven outside. This that Tosfos asks from Vayetze Yitzchak, Lasuach Pasada, because Yitzchak, there was no minyan over there, and therefore it's a question how we daven outside, but if there's a minyan, you can daven outside. Siyam HaShas is like a very good case. It was open without a roof, but it was surrounded by walls, but it was a huge area. So what's the status over there? Could be you have the Maila that this Oiris, which we saw, one of the Pshatim and Tosfos is that if you're at a place where in this Oir, okay, that's a good Shiloh. Just before being Masakim, one final pointer, this whole din that the Gemara brings, which we said is brought in Shulchan Aruch, the Rambam, the Rif and the Rambam don't bring a halacha. And the Madane Yomtiv, which is the Tosfos Yomtiv, the Madane Yomtiv on the Rosh asks, why don't they bring this din la halacha? It's not brought, and the Rif and the Rambam don't bring this halacha. And the Rashash asks this question, and the Rashash says, because really there's a different Gemara, how the Rashash says, L'chayra is contradicting, it's a stira to this Gemara, which means doesn't hold of this Gemara. The Gemara in the beginning of Brachas, the Gemara says there was an Amoira that was on the way, and he went into a churva to daven. And he was Very good, very good. You're holding there already? Yeah. It's Taf Gimel. What does the Gemara say? The Gemara says, very good. The Gemara says that Eliyahu Navi said, you masakin, you put yourself in danger by going into a churva. You shouldn't have done it. The Gemara says you learn 3 things. You don't go into a churva. You're not allowed to daven. You're not allowed not to go into a churva. So what comes out? Oh, Shmami, no, one of the dinim were, V'lamadati shemaspal l'maderach, you're allowed to daven on the go, on the road, on the way. So Rashash says that Gemara is not like our Gemara. And since it's a machlekes ha-Gemaras, therefore the Rambam and the Rif don't bring a la halacha. They paskin you could daven outside. Again, the Shulchan Aruch brings a la halacha. So just to be masakim, the terutzim, firstly masakim, just the terutzim, either it's Hara Maria, and we have many different pshatim what the mile of Hara Maria is. The mile of, if there's no oivrei derech, that's why Yitzchak was able to daven outside. Or because there was trees, the Bach's teretz. We saw the teretz, the Zohar says he davened in the Ma'aras HaMachpelah. And then, how the Rashash says, another teretz, but I'm sorry, I left that. The Rashash says, so what is yep shot in the Gemara? I'm sorry, not that he says it's a steer and we don't paskin like this Gemara. The Rashash says, Biksa doesn't mean a valley, Biksa means a small house. You're not allowed to daven in a small house. If it's very small, maybe a tiny hut, you're not allowed to daven over there. That's what the Rashash says. So that's another teretz. Yitzchak was able to daven outside because it was, Biksa means a small house, he davened outside. So just to be masakim, the dinim of you're not allowed to daven outside, one should not daven when it's oivrim v'shavim. If people are not passing by, you could daven there. A place of mechitza is even outside, you could daven. A place where it's nes'oyer, a nes, even if it's outside, you're allowed to daven there. Tvila, davening, is only Shemay Nesrei. Anything that's not Shemay Nesrei, you could daven outside. The Malkum where there's a minyan, a tzibur, you could daven outside. And then we see now another teretz, which is not really lahalacha, that you could always daven outside as long as it's not inside in a small house, which the Rashash explains like that, the Rif and the Rambam, but lahalacha, the din is not to daven outside. Have a good Shabbos.